At the turn of the 14th century, the most powerful king in Europe decided he was going to surgically remove one man, a single rebel, from the history books. But in his obsession to destroy the man, he accidentally created an immortal legend. This is the story of how a calculated act of state terror backfired spectacularly. And that's really the central question here, isn't it? This wasn't just a punishment. King Edward I of England poured incredible resources, we're talking military, financial, psychological, into the slow public dismantling of William Wallace. It was a total obsession. And to get why, you have to understand the world Edward had built, and how this one commoner threatened to burn it all to the ground. So our story really comes to a head right here at Smithfield, London, on August 23rd, 1305. You have thousands of people packing the grounds, and they're not there for a simple hanging. That was Tuesday. No, they came because King Edward himself had personally choreographed this spectacle of terror. This wasn't just about showing power. It was about broadcasting a very specific, very brutal message. To really get what Edward was protecting, you have to see his power for what it was. He wasn't just a king, he was the head of what was basically a continent-wide protection racket. And the feudal system? That was his business model. The rich own the land, the poor work it, and the king gets his cut. You swear loyalty, you keep your castle and your head. For Edward, this wasn't tyranny. It was order. God's order. So it's no surprise that when Edward's war machine rolled north, Scotland's nobles did the math. They had land, titles, and a lot to lose, so they kneeled. They signed these ragman rolls, which weren't just a surrender. They were a legal document handing over an entire country. From Edward's point of view, the game was over. He controlled the lords controlled the people. Rebellion was, mathematically impossible. But Edward made a huge miscalculation. See, he knew how to control rich men with something to lose. What he had no idea how to handle were men who had nothing left. And the man who lit that fuse was William Wallace. To the entire English system, this guy was basically invisible. No title, no castle, no official power. He was a complete nobody. And what happened next was a clash of two totally different worlds. On one side, you've got the most advanced killing machine in Europe, armored knights, basically medieval tanks, fighting because they were told to. And on the other, you have farmers with sharpened pitchforks, fueled by a rage their own nobles had walked away from. Wallace just bypassed the aristocracy and plugged directly into that raw, volcanic fury of ordinary people. The rebellion didn't kick off with some big battle. It started with a statement, one written in blood. The killing of the English sheriff of Lanark wasn't just random violence. It was a targeted assassination. This man was the living symbol of English law. By killing him, Wallace essentially tore up the rulebook. There was no going back from that. Well, word of what happened at Lanark spread like wildfire. What started as a small, brutal act of defiance was about to blow up into a full-blown military crisis for England. And it all came to a head at a place that would become legendary in Scotland, Stirling Bridge. Okay, so what Wallace did here was just pure genius, and it was born out of desperation. The English commander, John de Varenne, was arrogant. He looked at the Scottish army and saw a bunch of peasants. He saw the bridge as just something to cross. But Wallace, he saw a fatal choke point. He patiently waited, let just enough of England's elite heavy cavalry get across onto this marshy ground where their massive war horses were useless. And then he unleashed his spearmen. The entire physics of medieval warfare got flipped on its head. The aftermath sent a message of absolute desecration. The Scots didn't just kill the English treasurer, a man named Hugh de Cressingham. They flayed his body. There are stories that Wallace himself had a piece of the man's skin made into a belt for his sword. This wasn't just a victory. It was a primal, visceral rejection of English rule, using the same psychological brutality that Edward loved to use himself. Back in London, the news from Stirling was an absolute bombshell. Edward finally understood that Wallace wasn't just another rebel. He was an idea, a contagion that could infect his entire feudal order. Just killing him in a battle would only make him a martyr. No, Edward needed him alive. So the war shifted. It went from open battle to a 7-year intelligence-driven manhunt. And Edward, well, he weaponized the one thing he understood perfectly, greed. He flooded Scotland with silver, putting this massive bounty on Wallace's head. Suddenly, every inn, every village, every desperate farmer became a potential informant. Poverty is a powerful tool of state control, and Edward knew exactly how to use it. So while Wallace was hiding out in the wilderness, Edward launched a second war, a war for public opinion. And this was one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns of the medieval era. The goal was to paint Wallace not as a political enemy, but as a feral, subhuman monster. The stories weren't true, of course, but they were effective. Edward was building a stage for an execution, and he needed an audience that was screaming for blood. And after 7 years, the trap finally closed. In August 1305, Wallace was captured in his sleep. There was no final heroic battle, just the sudden, crushing reality of betrayal. And the man who sold him out wasn't English. He was a fellow Scot who, I guess, did the math and chose a chest full of silver over his countrymen. Wallace was then dragged to London for what can only be called political theater. The trial at Westminster Hall was never, ever about justice. It was a state-run production. The ending was already written. This was all about legally branding Wallace a criminal before the state could physically annihilate him. And the big charge was high treason. Now, in the medieval mind, this was the worst crime imaginable. It wasn't just a crime against a king, it was a crime against God's chosen representative, a violation of the entire cosmic order. The punishment for that wasn't just death, it was total annihilation, body and soul. But when that charge was read, Wallace completely shattered the court script with one single sentence. He hit them with this devastating legal argument. How can you betray a king you never swore loyalty to in the first place? He wasn't a traitor, he was an enemy combatant, a prisoner of war. And with that one line, he collapsed the entire legal foundation of the English trial, basically declaring Scotland's independence in the heart of London. The court, of course, had zero interest in legal truth. The verdict was a done deal. But having failed to break Wallace's spirit with propaganda or legal tricks, Edward moved on to the final, most savage part of his plan, a public performance of state-sponsored terror. What happened next wasn't an execution. It was a blueprint for the systematic demolition of a human being. Every single step was a ritual, designed for maximum pain and psychological impact. He was dragged naked for miles, hanged to the brink of death, brought back, and then disemboweled while he was still conscious, forced to watch himself be taken apart. And Edward didn't just bury the pieces. He weaponized them. Wallace's dismembered body parts were preserved in tar and displayed in the biggest cities across England and Scotland. The execution became a permanent, kingdom-wide broadcast, a grotesque billboard designed to crush anyone else's will to resist. But Edward, the ultimate control freak, made one massive, catastrophic miscalculation. He completely misunderstood human psychology. The sight of their hero's butchered limbs didn't create fear. It created a rage so total, so absolute, that it burned away any last thought of compromise. This was the ultimate backfire effect. I mean, look at this. Within 6 months of Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce, a nobleman who had previously bent the knee to Edward, harnessed that national fury and launched a new, much more organized war. Edward's savagery didn't end the rebellion. It became the rocket fuel for its final victory. He literally caused the exact opposite of what he wanted. So, in the end, Edward's entire imperial machine, his armies, his spies, his laws, his carefully planned cruelty, was all aimed at erasing one man. But terror has a breaking point. The man died on a table in London, but the idea he stood for, a Scotland free from English rule, that became a ghost that haunted Edward's kingdom and ultimately came back to win the war. And that really leaves us with this one big question. King Edward proved you can take a man apart piece by bloody piece. But his failures shows that some ideas, once they're let loose and sealed in martyrdom, become far more powerful than flesh and bone could ever be.